Welcome to CN Live. This is the premiere episode of Season 3, Dissident Intellectual. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
Today we're speaking with Professor Richard Falk about his new memoir, Public Intellectual. Falk became prominent in the United States and abroad after visits to North Vietnam, where he met the then Prime Minister Pham Von Dong, to Iran during the Islamic Revolution, when he met in Paris with Ayatollah Khomeini. In South Africa, he met Nelson Mandela during the height of the struggle against apartheid, and he visited Palestine and Israel many times over. His memoir relates encounters that he had with other well-known public figures in law, academia, political activism, and Hollywood. Falk mentored the thesis of former FBI Director Robert Mueller, and he taught General David Petraeus as well. Falk's writings and activism collided with the U.S. over militarism, nuclear weapons, and its Palestine-Israel foreign policy, especially when he was the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine. Falk was named the 2010 Outstanding Public Scholar in Political Economy by the International Studies Association. He's been nominated annually for the Nobel Peace Prize since 2009.
Welcome to CN Live, Professor Falk. Please tell us a little bit about your upbringing, your education, and major influences in your life.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be your guest today. That's quite a difficult question, which covers, I guess, 100 pages or so of my memoir. But I grew up in New York City, Manhattan, right across from Central Park, in a very secular Jewish family that was not mindful of ethnic tradition. So I had very little sense of what it meant or didn't mean to be a Jew. And I went to a high school there in New York City, had a somewhat troubled childhood because my parents had married on condition they not have children. And I was the second of these unwanted children. And my sister, who was older than I, had a lifetime of trouble, actually. She was in mental institutions. And so far I've avoided that fate. But it gave me a lot of trouble in my adolescence. I then went to a school in New York, a high school that fancied itself one of the good ones. And from there went to the University of Pennsylvania as an undergraduate, and probably only got in because my father had graduated from there, and I was not a stellar student at that point. And in fact, found myself on academic probation at the end of the first year there. But I was a pretty good athlete, which seems unlikely at this stage of life, but I had a Major League Baseball tryout in New York City before the New York Giants moved to San Francisco, which dates me somewhat. But fortunately, I was not chosen to be a professional baseball player, or my life would have been different, and I doubt that it would have been better. But anyway, I then went to law school, mainly because I didn't know what else to do after finishing my undergraduate training, and was trying to find ways not to be a Wall Street type lawyer as my father was. And so I took all these very marginal courses and ended up with international law, and was interested in India and did a lot of work on Indian law, and was supposed to have a Fulbright to India when I graduated from Yale Law School. But as fate would have it, the State Department canceled the India Fulbright program that year because India had failed to pay for some wheat And this was to punish them by depriving this huge country of its Fulbright fellows for a year. They renewed the program the next year, I think, understanding how silly this was as a gesture of disapproval. But in the meantime, it changed my life because I didn't have anything to do, and someone suddenly got very sick at the Ohio State School of Law, and they were so desperate to find someone to teach a couple of courses that they found me. And I found them, and I immediately realized that the academic setting was right for me, that it allowed me to do what I wanted when I was young. I enjoyed teaching, and I liked the freedom of an unstructured professional surrounding. So I stayed there for 6 years until I got an unexpected offer to visit Princeton, and Princeton had a long-standing empty chair, endowed chair in international law, and they couldn't find anyone for years, and so they also seemed desperate enough to invite me, and I stayed there for 40 years, which I always describe as a biblical interval. After that, moved to California, taught periodically at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and at various other institutions as a visitor. I don't know if I should say more about, in the course of this experience, I discovered my political identity. My father was quite strong personality with a very conservative outlook, and he had been in the Navy in World War I and never got over it. He had been on an admiral's staff, the Admiral of the Atlantic Fleet, and I'm named after, my middle name is Anderson, which was the name of this admiral. And he was the lawyer for the leading anti-communists in the US at that time, including Kerensky, who was the interim prime minister between the Tsar and the Russian Revolution. And I knew him as a kid living in New York. And when I went to Ohio State particularly, I was struck by the racism there. The African-American students had to pay more to live less conveniently because all the off-campus housing was owned by the members of the Board of Trustees that didn't want to rent to minorities. And so they had to live at a distance. And so as a young faculty person, I was part of a legal petition. They realized their position was so indefensible that they gave way. So the case never came to anything, but it was sort of an introduction to political life for me. And gradually I developed what I would call a progressive standpoint toward political issues. I was at Harvard for a year during the time I was at Ohio State for 6 years. And in that year, Fidel Castro came and gave a talk. It was when he was shortly after he assumed power in Cuba and made a kind of victory trip to the UN and visited both Princeton and Harvard during that time. And I found that point of view rather congenial, even though I never associated myself with a hardline political party or dogma. and therefore am not traditionally left enough to satisfy real leftists, and much too left to satisfy liberals. So it's in some ways a lonely identity that I've managed to contrive for myself. But I feel okay with it, and it hasn't gotten me into too much trouble. Some during the time I was at the UN, when I was attacked a lot as a self-hating Jew and other kinds of things, like being anti-Semite, and a lot of things that were sufficiently untrue that they didn't bother me. You know, it was annoying, of course, but it didn't bother me, and I didn't waste much time trying to say I'm not really an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. But, and it's allowed me to have, I think, a fairly interesting life, and to be lucky enough to keep abreast enough of the world to continue as a kind of a progressive commentator on the passing scene. Should I stop there?
That's fine. I was going to ask you also, what is a citizen pilgrim?
What is a citizen pilgrim? That was my way of not being a world citizen, which I felt was a kind of sentimental attachment, because to be a citizen in a meaningful way implies some kind of community. And there's no real community on a global level. There are a lot of, the UN, especially early in its existence, sort of purported to be a global community, the institutional foundation of a global community, but it never really escaped from being used by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council for their own agendas, and for all countries for their national interests. There was very little attention given in any genuine way to the global public interest, or to what one might call the human interest, as distinct from the national interest. And so I felt that we needed a global community to deal with the kinds of problems that are challenging the world in ways that sovereign states can't address, even the strongest ones. Climate change being perhaps the most obvious one, but the control of nuclear weapons is only a little less obvious, but equally troublesome in many ways. And I came across a passage in St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, which talked about people of faith believing in what's unseen and seeking a better future, what he called a heavenly city, not the kind of city which he used as a metaphor for the world that existed at the present time. So the citizen pilgrim in my terminology means something to be created, a journey to a future that's desirable and necessary, but not yet attained. And so it overcame for me the understandable but not compelling detachment from an exclusive national identity, and the efforts of some idealistic people to talk about being world citizens, not citizens of countries.
Professor Falk, thank you again for being with us. You mentioned heavenly city. It makes me think of a quite stomach-turning phrase from Ronald Reagan about the U.S. being that shining city on the hill. So I wanted to ask you about America's noble lie, the idea that it's an exceptional nation and that it only does good in the world and it's trying to spread democracy rather than pursuing its economic and geostrategic interests like all world powers do. It's so false on so many levels, but so many American people believe this. They're told constantly about that. And I wanted to ask you, what are the roots of this American exceptionalism, and what role does the media play in promulgating that?
Yes, I've been puzzled by it also because it's so incompatible with the actuality of how America acts in the world and in its own internal way of addressing social economic issues. And this isn't something that deviated from a glorious beginning, because one has to look at the treatment of Native Americans at the origin of the US experience, and also, of course, slavery and the legacy of slavery, which were all part of early America. But I think the city on the hill terminology came out of the early religious communities that were the most prominent settlers and sort of defined the American dream and wanted to show that the American experiment was different than what the European experience had been, and that it would its hope was to create a country and a political religious experience that would inspire others elsewhere. And this somehow took root and was part of how the U.S. branded itself in this way. And it did have I think the advantages of not having a formal colonial system to defend and get rid of. And that allowed it to play a role globally as the rescuer of democracy in the 20th century, both in World War I and World War II. And it was seen and it saw itself as this land of prosperity and power and influence, and yet seeking to create a better future, that it was struggling with its problems, the problems of racism and poverty. And I think after World War II in 1945, it projected an image of liberalism, of wanting a more peaceful world that came initially from Woodrow Wilson in a way after World War I. And so this, it was seen as less cynical and more dedicated to an improving global setting than other countries. And somehow this was swallowed by the American public in a way that seemed impervious to contradiction. That meaning that no matter what the US did, and I think Vietnam was the first real test of this exceptionalism, at least in the course of my lifetime, and it completely suppressed the ugly sides of the American experience in Vietnam. And it produced a kind of defensive trauma, because on the one hand, It had total military superiority, yet it managed to lose the war. And that's a lesson that the bureaucracy and the public have yet to learn, that military power doesn't control history at this stage of human development. And all the colonial wars were won by the weaker side militarily. And this points also to the Israel-Palestine conflict, where Israel managed to go against the anti-colonial flow of history and establish what I consider to be a settler colonial state in defiance of the historical trend. But to do that, they had to use disproportionate force, because when imposing a Jewish society, a Jewish state on a non-Jewish society in the middle of the 20th century was something that could not be done peacefully, and it could not be
Professor,
done legally.
we're going to get into Palestine actually just a little bit later in this interview. The bulk of the interview will probably be about Palestine. So I just wanted to bring you back to this notion of American exceptionalism. You know, there was that 7-year period after the defeat in Vietnam, and then between that and the Ronald Reagan era in 1980, in which we saw, it seemed to me, the U.S. becoming more mature and looking at itself, the Church Committee, the other committees that looked into the crimes that intelligence committees had committed, and also, of course, Watergate, and the feeling of losing. I think the militarists in the U.S. were on their back feet, and there was a unique opportunity there to examine this lie, this exceptionalist lie, where the evidence is so clear, because the U.S. has overthrown numerous democratically elected leaders and installed dictators, or in Iran, a king, put a king back on the throne, the opposite of 1776. And yet Reagan came and shut that down and resurrected again these mythologies of the United States. And one other example being Ho Chi Minh having written 6 letters to Harry Truman, wanting to have an alliance with the U.S. He ignored them, and Ho Chi Minh based his speech for Vietnamese independence on the U.S. Declaration of Independence. I think that could lead into Elizabeth's next question.
Yes,
No,
definitely.
I think that's
I'm sorry.
forgotten,
Yes.
a forgotten period. I think it's very important that you mention that was the closest we have ever come to challenging the exceptionalist myth. Of course, it was covered in the Carter presidency by proclaiming this deep foreign policy commitment to human rights. You know, that Brzezinski and Carter evolved really almost self-consciously to overcome the memory of Vietnam. And you remember that George H.W. Bush, at the end of the first Gulf War, said, we finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome. And by that he meant we've rediscovered our power in the world. And by doing that, we again are a force for good, and the exceptionalism. So in a certain way, Reagan paved the way toward this kind of renewal of exceptionalism, American. And then after 2001, with the terrorist attack, the second Bush really portrayed the world in this dualistic way, that there were terrorists and then there were us and our friends. And so you did really have a kind of renewal of American innocence.
I just wanted to return for a moment to Vietnam. If you could tell us a little bit about your visit to North Vietnam, about who you met, and what you experienced there.
again, it's a long story, but I'll try to make it as short as possible. I had been an academic opponent of the war almost from the beginning, because I had the insight, which I think was validated by later experience, that intervention in this period where colonialism was collapsing is a failed strategy. In other words, I approached it more or less in this academic tradition of political realism, that this was a dumb thing to be doing, to try to take over from the French, who had lost the so-called French Indochina War, and to come and think we could reverse Vietnamese nationalism, which was headed by a charismatic leader, Ho Chi Minh, that had mobilized the society, even this part of the society that was controlled by Western-oriented leadership, the South Vietnam. So I was sufficiently well known, I guess, as a critic of this intervention that I was invited to. There was a period in the war where McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, was saying this was the most surgical bombing in history and avoided doing any damage to civilian society and so on. And the Vietnamese, who were very clever in always making use of global solidarity support groups, invited a French association of lawyers to come and view the bomb damage, essentially. And these French lawyers decided that it would be much more effective to have an American come. And so they approached me, and for somewhat complicated reasons, it was difficult for me to agree to go, but I agreed to go, and went with only one other young lawyer, and we arrived at a time where viewing the bomb damage was interesting and relevant, and we did, and there were whole cities and villages that we saw that were completely destroyed, and so it was a lie to call it surgical bombing. And but the real importance was that it was a moment when the North Vietnamese were eager to see if they could negotiate a peace. This was 1968, and it was shortly after Lyndon Johnson withdrew from running a second time as president, and sort of indicated that the Vietnam policy was a failure. So they interpreted that as a receptivity to a kind of peaceful initiative. Before I went, oddly enough, and this I guess shows the way America works, at least at a certain level, I was asked to go. I was invited to, the government knew that I was invited and planned to go. And to my surprise, they invited me to come to the Pentagon and talk to them. I knew a couple of people that were there, working there, the sort of assistant secretary of defense level. And I went. It's the only time I've ever been in the Pentagon. And they were working on the Pentagon, what became the Pentagon Papers, these people, was then a secret study inside the government showing the failure of the war, basically, the failed strategy of the war. And they said, we want to give you a letter from Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State indicating an American initiative along the lines of peace, peaceful settlement. And I said, prepared to take this letter, even though I didn't see the text at that point. And they said, but there's one condition we have to impose, and that is that you don't speak publicly against the war in the future. And I couldn't do that because not only was it against my principles, but I had agreed already to be a speaker on my return from Vietnam to Paris. There was a big meeting there. And so I never saw the letter, and I don't know what was in it. And I'm not sure if these bureaucrats had the capacity, they were talking on their own, or they had some encouragement from their superiors. But anyway, I went, and that's why I had this opportunity to meet several times with Pham Von Dong, the prime minister, a very impressive man. And I was impressed generally by the leadership that Ho Chi Minh essentially had gathered around him. And I was also impressed by the fact that people saw him not so much as a kind of image of politician or strong leader, but they saw him as a teacher. They kept using the metaphors of teaching and how when they made a mistake, rather than punish them, he would try to have them learn from their experience. He had a great effect humanly on the people that worked. And this was different than any other communist leadership I had experience with some East Europeans and Soviet Union previously, and was very unimpressed with the kind of people but you always felt in Vietnam that the most important person in the room was also the most talented, which is something you don't feel in Washington or in most places in the world. I was very impressed humanly by Vietnam, and I changed my way of thinking about the war because I saw it much more from the perspective of the victims than I had before I went. I mean, it was an intellectual position before I went. After I was there, it became a kind of existential identification with a low technology, very beautiful society, and very cultured and appealing people, very engaging society in many ways. And to see this low technology society devastated by this high technology war machine had a big impact on me. And when I came back to Europe, somehow or other there was an awareness that I had this sort of peace proposals from Pham Von Dong that were actually more favorable to the US than what Kissinger negotiated 4 years later and got the Nobel Peace Prize for. So I was interviewed a lot when I came back in '68. But when I tried to describe my own shift of interest, of outlook to the media, they were totally disinterested. They only wanted to understand the realities from this political realist sort of perspective, which disappointed me, but I suppose in retrospect shouldn't have surprised me. And I went back a second time to North Vietnam as part of a trip with prominent anti-war activist David Dellinger, Cora Weiss, to receive 3 American pilots that had been prisoners of war there and were released to the peace movement rather than to the government. And it was a stage in the war where the interest of the US knew it had lost the war in the sense of the political outcome, but it wanted to obtain the release of these prisoners in Hanoi, because that was a domestic political issue, and there was an election coming up in '72. This was in '72. And so that too was quite a dramatic trip, but a very different kind of visit. And I've been back, I went and spent 6 months in Vietnam in 1999 to teach their young diplomats, diplomatic academy, which was a really interesting experience in its own way. And one of my surprising, two surprising discoveries. One was they were more interested in Buddhism than communism, and these young diplomats. And the second was that they, many of them had studied in Moscow as part of their educational experience, and they were very nostalgic about their time in the Soviet Union, and often met their future partners in life and had romantic memory, all kinds of memories. And it was so different than the kind of hostile images that had been projected in the US during the Cold War that it was quite striking to me while I was there.
Yeah, that's incredible insight over that span of time as to how things changed. I believe, Joe, do you have a next question?
Yes, Professor. I want to know whether you were attacked when you came back to the U.S. in 1968 after that trip to North Vietnam. A first attack may have been a long series that you've endured over your life.
No, surprisingly, that time, because I came with these peace proposals that were really very forthcoming, and it was quite a tragedy in a way for both countries that they weren't accepted. A large number of people were killed in that 4-year period before they finally did come to some kind of agreement. But the New York Times, to my surprise, put my experience on the front page for a couple of days, actually, and it was treated. And the State Department called me and asked me if I would come to Washington and give a briefing of my experience, and they came to me actually because I felt guilty about being away from my classes for the time that I was in Vietnam. And I actually, the first time I was really seriously attacked was coming back from Iran. Then I was attacked a lot. And there were people there was a committee to investigate me set up by the Board of Trustees at Princeton. And I had a series of, they were different than the kind of Zionist attacks, but they were definitely aimed at discrediting and, if possible, dismissing me from.
I'm going to get to Iran in a moment, but I just wanted to ask you one other thing here before we leave the Vietnam era. Clearly, the popular protests were what drove so much of that defeat. Eventually, the U.S. had to admit, and there was a role of professors then also in opposing the war. I'm wondering if you felt do you feel any inherent conflict between academia and activism?
No, on the contrary, I feel that carrying your ideas out of the classroom onto the street, so to speak, is taking yourself seriously, and that students respect that, even if they disagree with you. I wouldn't say all students, but the great majority of. I have had I've taught now probably in 8 or 9 universities, and I've never had any kind of real hostile a reaction from that kind. Faculty don't like it because faculty are basically fairly timid in their way of experiencing life, and they don't want to be, they don't want to expose themselves. They will say things at cocktail parties and over lunch, but they don't want to be in any kind of public arena where these ideas. But I feel that the educational deficiency is partly that we don't sufficiently encourage people to have a kind of self-aware, engaged citizenship. That's really an important element of democracy. Is to flourish has to be about more than elections and the kind of commentary that one receives from the media. So I think if you're honest about your views and don't discriminate against those who don't agree with you, don't encounter any kind of friction with students, any kind of notable friction with students, you do with colleagues. And I had some, in fact, there's one incident I had at Princeton that I describe at pretty great length in the memoir, where somebody who was really very critical of my public stance took it out on a student. We were the two readers of a senior thesis. Every Princeton student has to write a senior thesis. And she was basically my student, and I gave her an A, and he gave her an F, which was outrageous. I mean, from any point of view. She went on to be third ranked at Harvard Law School after Princeton. She was an outstanding student and worked very hard on this thesis. But it was a way of somehow, I think, a rather psychologically suspect way of trying to react to me at her expense. And I tried to get he was a formidable character, this guy. And he was very conservative overall, and the university administration sort of liked having him around because he would say things at public faculty meetings that they didn't want to say themselves, but were glad that other people said them. He was an anti-activist and preserved what he regarded as the integrity of the university and so on. And so I had a great deal of trouble getting this grade changed of this student. I finally did 3/4 succeed, but it was a terrible experience for her and extremely unfair, but it shows the kind of ways in which faculty can abuse their authority at the expense of vulnerable students.
I don't think that comes to a shock to many of us that kind of thing could happen in academia. But
this was very extreme.
Yeah,
in my view.
You think then it's not enough just for a professor to lay out the facts? For example, give the history to show that the American politicians are lying about America's intentions abroad, or to point out international law that the U.S. might be breaking. But you think it's okay to go beyond that to actually, as you say, voice an opinion?
Yes, I believe if you're forthright about it produces a deeper and better understanding, even on the part of critics. And I always tell people, and I think I discuss this a little bit somewhere in the book also, that I myself learn more from critics than I do from people who agree with me. That there's a kind of dialogic interaction that is very valuable. And therefore, I think I use the phrase advocacy scholarship to talk about expressing your opinion and allowing others to understand where you're coming from. And I think it's a much more honest way of being a scholar or teacher than it is by pretending a neutrality and objectivity that doesn't exist.
Okay, you're watching CN Live, and we're speaking with Professor Richard Falk about his memoir, Public Intellectual. I'd like to turn to Iran now. You also made a visit to Paris to see the Ayatollah Khomeini just before he was leaving for Iran. Can you tell us about that? That must have been an extraordinary experience.
Yes, that was I first made a visit. It was the end of a visit to Iran itself, where I had gone with Ramsey Clark, the former US Attorney General. And we had had great opportunity there to see firsthand the last stage of this revolutionary moment in Iran, and met most of the leading personalities involved, including the Prime Minister and some of the people that had supported the Shah and some of the religious leaders. And because we had been invited by the interim president, a man named Mehdi Barzagan, and because they felt, and we were invited to understand, they felt the revolution wasn't being understood outside of Iran. And because they felt we made a genuine effort to do that, they arranged this meeting for us with Khomeini in Paris. It wasn't part of our itinerary originally. And he was, in turn, extremely eager to talk with what he perceived to be relatively knowledgeable Americans, and particularly with Ramsey's former ties with government at a high level. And at that point, he was extremely preoccupied by the anxiety that the US would intervene in the way it had in '53 to overthrow the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh. And so he put a lot of questions to us. It was an interesting reversal of what one would expect in such a meeting. And we did have, it was long, it was two or 2.5, 3 hours. And we ended it because we had to catch a plane to come back to the US. But we had the opportunity to ask him a lot of questions that he answered very clearly. He was very impressive intellectually, in the sense of being of this world, but sort of out of this world at the same time. A very interesting figure with very penetrating eyes, and had an extremely unusual talent for understanding complex political issues, even without a normal political education, and a sort of intuitive figure, intuitive talent. And from what I learned separately, he had this kind of talent for intervening in history at the right moment and knowing when not to act and when to act. He was quite a fascinating figure. The BBC editor of what they call the Persian Desk has written a very good biography of him that captures some of these qualities that he possessed. And the Iranian religious tradition out of which he came was something different than Islamic traditions in other parts of the Islamic world, had much deeper political roots and political relevance, and a much closer, more profound educational role in the lives of many young people in the country. So you understand, and I came to understand better, how this revolutionary movement grew out of the Iranian societal experience. Among the things that Khomeini himself talked about were how he thought non-Muslims would fare in the Iranian new Iran. And he gave a pretty interesting answer about Baha'is and Jews. And he said that since Judaism is an authentic religion, it will be a tragedy for us if the Iranian Jews leave the country. So, and we don't want that to happen, but they can't be too involved with Israel. And then for Baha'is, he said, they're not a genuine religion because they worship a prophet that came after Muhammad. And they have no place in Iraq. But in truth, later on, he intervened to save them from what could have been a genocide. There were up to 300,000 or so Baha'is in Iran. And there were some young mullahs that wanted to punish the Baha'i community because the Shah had used both Jews and Baha'is because he didn't trust he relied on these minorities because he thought they were vulnerable and he could use them for important government positions. But of course, it made them then seem like they were agents of the repressive side of his regime. The other thing that he said that was interesting, he said, don't say that this is an Iranian revolution, it's an Islamic revolution. And he said the whole idea of nation states was a European idea that was exported to us after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire fell. And our community is, our real community, or our most meaningful community, is the Islamic world, the Ummah, in its Arabic word. And he was not sectarian at all. I mean, in the sense of, he didn't emphasize the fact that Iran was from a Shia tradition and Saudi Arabia, for instance, was Sunni, or he really had this idea that the diversities of Islam all belonged in a single community, political community. And it's interesting that other sort of radical leaders that have emerged, like Osama bin Laden and the head of ISIS, they all emphasize the non-territorial character of political community that is authentic to the region and contrasts with these territorial sovereign states that were imposed by Europe.
Do you think that he may have been amenable to some accommodation with Saudi Arabia, which certainly, since the '79 revolution, has not seemed possible, but would be a solution to so many crises across the region, across the Middle East?
I think he was very amenable to accommodation with the U.S. and the West, but not so much with Saudi Arabia, but not because of the sectarian issue, but because of the dynasty. And he thought of the monarchy in Saudi Arabia in the same way he thought about the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. And he said that he himself only entered politics because there was a river of blood between the state and the people. He used that very vivid metaphor, and that he told us at that time that he wanted to resume a religious life, that he didn't have political ambitions. But when he went back to Iran, he went back to Qom, the religious city there, and did seem to resume the religious life. But what happened in the next phase, whether he was much more popular than he realized when he was in Paris, or he thought that only he could save the revolution, or the people around him convinced he had to intervene to save no one really has explained why he so decisively entered politics. And he was fairly ruthless toward those he believed to be his enemies or adversaries or infidels in some ways. And that was part of this temperament that was very pragmatic, not dogmatic in the normal religious way, but also very ruthless in preserving the kind of power that he felt was in accordance with Islamic values, I guess.
So before that happened, you came back to the U.S. and you wrote this op-ed in the New York Times, I believe, in which you had you said that the depiction of him as a fanatical reactionary, bearer of crude prejudices, seems certainly and happily false. You also said that he may provide us with a desperately needed model of humane governance for a third world country. So you presumably were attacked for that, but then you revised your views of Khomeini, didn't you? As he changed and crushed a lot of the other parts of that revolution to take full control.
Yes, that was a reaction to the talk. That op-ed piece, which they solicited, I didn't volunteer to write it because, and they sort of gave me a 24-hour deadline to produce it. And the most inflammatory part of the piece was the headline that I didn't write. It's called "Trusting Khomeini." And I got a lot of death threats and things, unpleasant feedback of that sort, mainly because of that headline that they provided, never cleared with me. I would not have given it. And there is, if you read the op-ed as a whole, I do try to put some language of uncertainty into these, the opinions that you just quoted. That was the hopeful side of my impressions, but I could see that it could turn in other directions as well. And I was in part trying to counter the hostility that was the mainstream way of perceiving the Iranian Revolution. And I was attacked subsequently by Anthony Lewis, the very prominent New York Times opinion writer. And he came to Princeton, gave a talk, and we had a conversation afterwards. And he was extremely critical of my understanding of the revolution.
Well, I'd like to move on to Palestine now, which has been a major focus of your career. At the time you were appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, the Israeli ambassador to the UN said, quote, he, meaning you, has taken part in a UN fact-finding mission which determined that suicide bombings were a valid method of struggle. He has disturbingly charged Israel with genocidal tendencies and accused it of trying to achieve security through state terrorism. Now, this was just when you were appointed, let alone everything that happened after that. And I was at the UN as a correspondent in those days, so I knew a lot about what was happening with you then. We get to that later. How did you respond to that? I guess you weren't surprised, but how did you respond to that initial attack on you before you started the job?
Well, that attack within the UN, I can't remember directly responding to it at all. As you undoubtedly knew, I made report all of the each year I made a report at the UN, and usually there was a press conference after that. And I was asked questions such as this at those press conferences. And I tried to explain my position. And on some of that, I mean, the points you actually mentioned, we never, or in this fact-finding commission, we never endorsed suicide bombing. We may have said, and I'd have to go back and read the exact language, we may have said that it was a understandable response given the absence of other options for resistance and given the denial of basic rights that the Palestinian people had been enduring for so long, and could have compared it to the kind of resistance to Hitler's occupation of Europe that also included what amounted to suicide bombing and terrorist attacks on cafes that were frequented by Nazi officers and things of that sort. But I don't remember the exact. And the genocidal tendencies came exclusively from an opinion piece I had written in an obscure Turkish newspaper years earlier, maybe 8 or 9 years earlier. Probably was an imprudent piece in some ways, but what I was saying there was that treating the Palestinians stereotyping them and punishing them collectively had a resemblance to some of the tendencies of the ways that Nazis addressed Jews, and that had the implications of moving in a genocidal, had genocidal tendencies. And I believe, if my memory, it's now a long time ago, it's like 17 or 18 years ago that I wrote this single op-ed piece, that I used the phrase taken from the poet Yeats about, he has a poem about slouching toward Jerusalem, and I borrowed that and I said slouching toward genocidal something or other, and it was in that spirit that I intended it more as a warning than as an indictment, but it was, as I should have expected, was manipulated and taken out of context.
Your predecessor, the South African John Dugard, I think his name was also highly critical of Israeli policy. Did they single you out because, for what reason would they? That you were American and you were Jewish, you were being disloyal? Did that have anything to do with it?
Yes, that probably had quite a lot to do with it. And I think I was, putting it immodestly, better known than John Dugard, who was known in South Africa, but pretty obscure on it. And Israel became, in this period, extremely worried about what they felt was the delegitimation of their state and their policies. And at the same time, they came to realize that if they tried to refute those criticisms substantively, they would have a very difficult time being convincing. So they shifted from the message to the messenger in that period and didn't bother. They basically didn't bother trying to say anything in our reports was wrong, but they did try to defame the person that was responsible for writing them. And I was much more vulnerable than John in that sense, because I wrote on controversial things on other subjects, and they were able to cherry pick enough to find things that I said about the Boston Marathon incident and a lot of other things. And then they have, there are a couple of NGOs that are basically Zionist Israeli front organizations, UN Watch and UN Monitor. And they were very active in writing to ambassadors and Secretary General and so on to defame me. And they were surprisingly successful in getting these important people, some of whom I knew, to denounce me publicly and call for my dismissal and things of that sort. And I followed up, because I was in a kind of UN position, I followed up with Ban Ki-moon at one point, and and I had met, he actually attended a reception at the UN that the President of the General Assembly had given, sort of in my honor when I was appointed, and we had sort of friendly conversation then. But on this occasion, where he attacked me, I think for my comments on the Boston Marathon and maybe something else as well, and I spoke to his principal assistant, someone called an aide-de-camp, who was an Indian guy, who said, well, we didn't do due diligence, was his phrase. We didn't do, by which he meant they didn't read anything beyond what the UN Watch had sent them, I think. And he said, oh, we'll clear this up. We're very sorry, we'll clear this up. But you have to understand, the Secretary General is up for a second term, and he wants to make sure that we don't seem indifferent to Israel. We're not, and certainly not anti-Israeli. And so I never heard from him again, but it was part of the territory, so to speak. John Bolton called me a fruitcake when I was appointed, and said that it it was an illustration of how bad the UN was.
Well, I think Ban Ki-moon, who I knew quite well over there, and I was probably in all 6 of those press conferences of yours, he went right along with the U.S., in particular something you wrote about 9/11 on your blog, and the Americans took that as an opportunity to try to get you sacked. And he condemned you, but he did say in the end that it was up to the Human Rights Council, which the Americans had left because, right, they didn't have, maybe they regretted it at that moment because they didn't have a say then about whether you, they were trying to tell the Human Rights Council to get rid of you, and they were no longer on itself.
I would never have been elected if they had been on. See, you have to be selected by consensus, and Canada actually abstained, and they spoke against me, but they didn't vote against me, and the U.S. was not a member. So that, I'm sure that they did regret it. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I think the Obama administration rejoined the council. So
yes.
when that incident, tell us, well, we'll leave that for later because I wanted to continue on Palestine. You have had, in 2012, you made a report or a statement about companies profiting from the occupation, and you named these companies, and that ticked off the corporate world as well as political world. But tell us about the importance of the BDS movement and some of the rules and laws and states in the U.S. now that are actually making it required for people to sign a statement saying you will not criticize Israel, not support BDS, or you can't get this job.
Yeah, well, we felt that was something tangible that would go beyond the mere rhetoric of criticizing Israel's policies and practices in the occupied territories, and that this would have a kind of societal outreach and support some of the civil society initiatives. And the BDS campaign was at a very early, relatively early stage at that point. And it did reinforce its campaign. And of course, it played into this backlash from Israel and its supporters, particularly in the United States and Western Europe, where the treatment of BDS is completely different than the comparable efforts to discredit South African apartheid, which I think is notable because we had at Princeton a quite active BDS South African movement, which was very much criticized by the board of trustees there and by alumni and others, but no one, as far as I remember, would criticize people that took part in BDS, except to say they were pursuing an imprudent or unwise or unpatriotic policy because South Africa was a strategic ally in the Cold War period. And but the idea that this was part of people's constitutional rights to support a nonviolent form of criticism of South Africa was beyond debate, and is but somehow in the Israel-Palestine context, it's treated as so reprehensible as to be criminalized if it's pursued in any kind of militant way. And trying to understand this, I think, does help one grasp this Israeli pushback against any effort to delegitimize their policies and practices. And I think that Israel learned from the South African experience that this combination of global solidarity and domestic resistance eventually created a new balance of forces that led their leadership to recalculate their own interests. They didn't have a moral reawakening and suddenly say, oh, multiracial constitutionalism is a good thing. They decided they'd be better off in a constitutional democracy than they were trying to persist with apartheid and being a pariah state internationally. And I think that's the best hope of the Palestinian struggle at the present time, is this combination of global solidarity initiatives and internal resistance, whether mostly nonviolent, but some armed resistance as well. And I think it's notable that Israel understands that better than the US, I believe, that wars are not won and lost only on the battlefield. That legitimacy, what I call legitimacy wars, are often the decisive kind of struggle for the political outcome that is decisive in the end. And this suggests that it's important to distinguish between what I call the symbolic level of politics, the norms, the legal, moral, and religious norms, and the substantive level of politics, the behavior on the ground, and so on. There's a recent decision of the International Criminal Court in The Hague that authorizes investigation of Israeli crimes in the occupied territory. In my view, that's a historic decision, even if, as I think likely, nothing will happen in terms of indictments and actual prosecutions, because it is a great victory for the Palestinians symbolically. It shows a credibility for the allegations of Israeli international crimes, and the Israeli reaction by showing that claiming that the court is engaged in some kind of what they call pure anti-Semitism is just a way of smearing the institution rather than facing the facts and the allegations. So symbolic politics are extremely important in these struggles over basic rights.
However, in the South African apartheid struggle, eventually Western governments turned against the apartheid government, and that was instrumental in the change that took place. We're not seeing that with Israel. In fact, just the opposite. The Biden administration has also condemned this ICC decision to investigate, and you could see when back 10 years ago, so when Palestine tried to become and eventually did, an observer state at the UN, the fierce battle against it by the US, because they knew that they could then join the ICC if they became an observer state at the UN, and that it could eventually lead to this. So we don't see that same thing happening, and therefore the two-state solution, I want to know whether you think that's absolutely dead now, and that it's Israel that's driving it by talking of annexing occupied territories or colonies in the West Bank. That is continuing, in my view, and I think you might agree with this, a continuing policy from Ben-Gurion's days in the Red House in Tel Aviv when they plotted to ethnically cleanse the country. It's a continuation of that. And by legally annexing, that would, and even Omar, I think the Prime Minister of Israel and others have said, if we did that, then we're an apartheid state. And that's what's happening right now, isn't it? They're actually moving. It's not de facto anymore. It could soon be legally apartheid. Isn't that right?
Yes. And the 2018 basic law that proclaims Jewish supremacy in Israel really removes any veil of disguise over the Israeli intention or the Zionist intention to have a state that is run for and by Jews as the supreme ethnic presence in the country, and to regard the West Bank and East Jerusalem as part of the Promised Land that has a biblical, not a legal mandate, but a biblical mandate. And Ben-Gurion, again, is relevant because he understood, even though he was himself anti-religious, he's quoted as saying, the Bible will be our instrument. And he recognized that that was a way of extending the Zionist project to cover the entire territory of historic Palestine. And it's an example, the project is an example of a utopian undertaking succeeding, because it couldn't have succeeded without the historical events of the Holocaust and the Western guilt after World War II that they didn't do enough to protect Jews, a whole series of developments, including the degree to which the Jewish diaspora was successfully mobilized after the Holocaust occurred. These factors enabled Israel to swim successfully against the historical currents of anti-colonialism. But to swim, as I've said, in order to do that, they met what they understood at the time and expected, very fierce resistance. And the only way they could deal with that was to impose this kind of regime that victimized non-Jews and the native people of Palestine in order to carry out the project.
Of course, Western governments didn't do enough in the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism is still a very real problem.
But should the Palestinians pay for that? See,
right.
Oh, and I didn't answer you. You said, and correctly, that in the anti-South African apartheid campaign, the governments of the West were finally enlisted to take part. But I think they took I wouldn't agree with the last part of what you said. It was that made a decisive difference, because it was Thatcher and Reagan that were persuaded to do this, and that was against their own kind of what shall one say, low profile racism. They were not persuaded either morally or politically, but they had faced increased grassroots pressures in their own societies. So my sense is that the positive Palestinian scenario depends on grassroots mobilization, plus this kind of pressure exerted by nonviolent initiatives, of which BDS is the most salient, but there are others like cultural boycotts and other kinds of initiatives that I think will be effective, are effective even now.
And do you not think that the U.S. government, if it changed its policy towards Israel and used the power that it has and actually acts as a statesman and not taking one side, and Trump administration is probably the worst of all of them in terms of taking Israel's side completely, wouldn't you think that would be necessary to bring some solution to this long crisis?
Well, it depends how is the leadership at that time in Israel saw the alternatives. See, I think as this, the decisive act in South Africa was the unexpected decision to release Mandela from prison after 27 years. That was a signal that they wanted to change. And I don't think they came to that because of intergovernmental pressure. I think they came to that because they found themselves in this pariah international position where they were under difficulty to participate in international sporting events, cultural events. They didn't want to live that way for the foreseeable future. And I think they may, and Mandela was, despite his radical early political experiences, saw the need to reassure the whites that they could keep their property and they could enjoy a decent life in South Africa. So there was a kind of negotiation that went on. And I think the Palestinians, if they get the decent leadership that I know they have potentially, I've met the people that could be effective leaders there, one of whom is in prison, Marwan Barghouti. And he's supposed, there are rumors that he's wants to be a candidate for president, even though he's in prison. I think they would be very accommodating in working out some kind of one-state solution based on the equality and human rights, protection of human rights, constitutional democracy. And I
Yes.
think Jews come to that understanding that there's a better alternative than fighting against the world, the peoples of the world, even if the governments are neutralized. They're not they haven't neutralized the governments that entered these normalization agreements with them. They've come to terms.
So you're saying
with,
I'm sorry, you're saying that popular resistance alone could help bring about a real change in Israel's behavior? Wouldn't they need the Olympic Committee to also boycott them, or sports, as you said, it was sports boycotts against South Africa?
No, I don't know at what stage this struggle is at the present time. You know, it's not where the South African movement was in the early 1990s. And Israel is not South Africa because they have more of a sense of entitlement at this point, and they have the memories still of the Holocaust, history of anti-Semitism, so they're scared to give ground, and they're also scared that the Palestinians may do the same thing to them that they did to the Palestinians, which is to accept a modest solution at one time, but make it not a real solution, but a stage in an ongoing struggle. See, what the Zionists did brilliantly was to get one step at a time, to go one step at a time. You know, the Balfour Declaration only promised them a homeland, never talked about a state. And there was a lot of opposition in Britain. It was purely colonial, but it was a lot of opposition to Britain to the idea of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. That was, and if you remember, the radical Zionist groups committed terrorist acts against the British. They wanted the British, first they depended on the British to get them in, and then they fought to get them out.
And the British threw it in the lap of the General Assembly.
Yeah.
We could speak a long time about that. I wanted to move on to another subject, but before that, one last one on Palestine. How do you see these moves by the U.S., Trump, to get the UAE and Sudan and other countries, and Morocco, to normalize relations with Israel? Isn't that ultimately fatal to the Palestinian cause?
No, I think it's the reverse of what I was talking about. It's symbolic politics favorable to Israel, but they were never very significantly allied with the Palestinian struggle, and they were scared of the Palestinian movement because they saw it as potentially a democratic Arab state, which was something that would be very threatening to them. You saw what they did in Egypt when there was a democratic movement that brought to power the Muslim Brotherhood, of all things. You'd think they would have loved the Muslim Brotherhood, but they much preferred a Mubarak or a Sisi, a general that suppressed the people. And so I don't think it has, and these regimes made the normalization, again, not for any wake up to the virtues of Israel, but because they got some weapons that they wanted, and they got goodwill in Washington from the Trump presidency. It was a hedge against his winning. If he won, they would be in good shape in the November elections that they probably thought he would win. And so that was a national interest calculation and an anti-Iranian move that Israel could be very helpful in confronting Iran. And Iran was the most formidable threat to the stability of the monarchies in the region. So it's one of these complicated diplomatic moves, I think.
Elizabeth, I think you have a question, Professor.
Yeah, before we move on, I just wanted to ask you about what you feel was the worst incident of censorship and smearing against you, and how you dealt with that, because a lot of us in the independent media have been, censored in various ways, and I think also a lot of our audience feels censored these days, and would like to hear your insight.
Probably my response is disappointing because I didn't feel I had many options I regretted it. Earlier in my career, I had real access to mainstream media, and that was cut off more or less completely, even though I'm very much sought after outside the US, particularly in the Middle East and to some extent in Western Europe and Asia. But I felt that this was something that was a price to be paid for the kind of political path I was following, and there wasn't much I could do about it, and I didn't really try to do much about it. I continued doing what I could do. I consider myself more of a writer than anything else, and they couldn't stop me from writing, at least not yet. They haven't stopped me from writing.
Thank you for your insight on that.
So I'm going to have to ask you about Robert Mueller, because he was your student. And of course, what Elizabeth was referring to there was people being shut down and being smeared as somehow Russian agents if you happen to criticize a politician in the US. If they get involved in a scandal, a way for American politicians now is if they are blamed something is exposed about them, they'll blame a foreign power. So Robert Mueller did not find the evidence that those people were looking for. Was he a student that you saw had integrity and someone that?
Well, oddly enough, because he's a very low-profile person, I had a less vivid recollection of him than of almost any of my thesis students, though he chose a subject that I was very, very close to at the time, which involved apartheid, actually. He wrote his thesis on the effort to challenge South African apartheid in the International Court of Justice. And he has a very nice acknowledgement to me in the preface to the thesis, where he thanks me for my advice and guidance and so on. But he takes a very interesting position in that, in the thesis, which is, to put it in a very summary form, that when law is ambiguous, you should do what is the morally right thing to do. And he felt that the arguments in relation to whether the court had authority to examine the extension of apartheid to what is now Namibia. It was then Southwest Africa, basically a mandate, like Palestine. It was like Palestine in that you could, South African legal defense was very sophisticated and quite good. I participated in that case, actually. And I think I must have suggested the topic to him. And so he handled it in a surprisingly sophisticated way for a person who at that stage had never gone to law school and was a graduating senior, and spoke and wrote and spoke very fluently and in a manner that indicated a kind of talent for legal analysis.
Well, that's a pretty extraordinary story there. Can't imagine anybody in his position. And are there students writing theses today about Israeli apartheid? The question is, why can't you criticize Israel in the United States? And I think you answered it maybe by saying about the Holocaust. Certainly that has a lot to do with it, doesn't it?
Yes, and you can, I wouldn't overstate that. You can do a thesis that's critical of Israel, or do papers or scholarly things, either as a student or as a faculty member, but you're likely to pay a price. That's the point. And the price isn't, I think it intimidates a lot of people, but it isn't, if you think about it, it is not so great. You won't be invited to certain kinds of conferences, you can't get institutional fellowships at think tanks in Washington or certain places that want to maintain close establishment ties. You may not get invited to universities that have influential Zionist administrators. There are a lot of things that can happen that impinge upon your life in marginal ways, but it's not like being put in prison or tortured, or people exaggerate the costs, and they don't take advantage, it seems to me, of the freedoms that do exist in a society like the US. That's what I meant by timidity. There's a kind of timidity that you find in faculties overwhelmingly, that there's so few people in these major universities that say publicly what they believe privately.
Well, on that slightly optimistic note, I think we will come to the end of our interview. We want to thank you so much for being with us for such a long time, for spending more than an hour and a half with us here on CN Live. And we wish you a lot of success with your book. It's called Public Intellectual, and it was just published by Professor Richard Falk, who we've been speaking with. I want to thank Elizabeth, my co-host, Kathy Vogan, the producer, and our audience. And I remind you to please go to Patreon and become a patron so that we can continue to bring you interviews like this on CN Live. For CN Live, this is Joe Loria. Goodbye.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
I enjoyed the experience, and the questions were very probing and good.
Okay, I left out 9/11. I got a sense you didn't want to go there. It's very touchy, and do a whole show on that.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
If you are a consumer of independent news, then the first place you should be going to is Consortium News, and please do try to support them when you can. It doesn't have its articles behind a paywall. It's free for everyone. It's one of the best news sites out there, and it's been in the business of independent journalism and adversarial independent journalism for over 2 decades. I hope that with the public's continuing support of Consortium News, it will continue for a very long time to come. Thank you so much.